A middle-aged black man stepped into the overcrowded emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital, shirt damp with sweat, one hand pressed to his chest. He didn't call for help. Didn't raise his voice. Just placed a form gently on the counter. The head nurse glanced at it, then waved it off. Not urgent. Probably just wants painkillers. He said nothing. Just sat down quietly, surrounded by cold stares and whispered assumptions. But no one knew, the man they dismissed was about to shake the entire hospital. A hidden identity. A truth waiting to surface. And by the time they realized who he was, it was already too late. It was a quiet weekend morning. The sky had just cleared after a light drizzle. While the streets outside slowly stirred awake to greet a new day, inside the emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital, everything was slipping into an uncontrollable storm of chaos. The chairs were packed. Some patients leaned against the walls, others sat on the floor clutching their wounds or holding tight to loved ones burning with fever. Names echoed through the intercom, clashing with moans of pain, frustrated voices, and tense conversations between patients and overworked staff. The air was thick, with antiseptics, dampness left by last night's rain, and the stifling body heat of dozens crammed into a sealed space. At the center of that storm stood Karen, the head nurse. White, 45, square-jawed, eyes perpetually wide as if ready to bark at anyone. She moved briskly from station to station, giving sharp, loud commands. Her faded blonde hair was tied hastily at the nape, and her wrinkled blouse clung to her frame after 2 back-to-back shifts. Karen wasn't patient. And this morning, she wasn't pretending to be. A small technical glitch made everything worse. The triage system had frozen. The entire process had to be done manually. Patient records printed in the wrong order, names mixed with ID numbers, leaving the intake team scrambling, unsure who to prioritize. Amid the noisy crowd, a black man entered. Middle-aged, about 6 feet tall, wearing a clean gray button-down and khaki pants. His posture was composed, his appearance neat but unassuming. His left hand clutched his chest, each step slow, restrained, as if he was trying to hold back the pain. His face was calm, though pale. Beads of sweat began forming on his forehead. No one noticed him. He made no sound, no scene, no cry for help. He simply walked up to the reception counter, took a form, sat down, and filled it out. His handwriting was precise, slanted, steady, elegant, unlike the hurried scrawls of most others in the room. Once done, he stood, walked over to where Karen was standing, and quietly handed her the form. Karen was in the middle of scolding another nurse over the jumbled paperwork. She took the sheet from him without looking up, skimmed the first line, and carelessly tossed it into the file tray like it was a survey form she didn't ask for. No glance. No question about his condition. No concern for the pain clearly written on his face. She muttered under her breath, firm but clear, as if it was a line she had rehearsed hundreds of times, probably just here for some painkillers. A young nurse nearby hesitated, then asked cautiously, "Should we assess his priority level?" Karen shook her head, visibly annoyed. "No need. If he walked in on his own, he's clearly not critical." The man said nothing. He didn't show anger. He didn't push back. He simply nodded, turned, and walked toward the end of the hallway. No one offered him a seat. No one guided him. He chose a quiet corner against the wall, sat down, laced his fingers together over his knees, and stared ahead. His eyes weren't bitter, or panicked, just tired, and heavy with a silence you couldn't quite read. He was used to being seen through a lens of prejudice. Used to having to prove he was worth someone's attention. But today, he chose silence. Not out of weakness. But because he was watching. And he knew, once the truth came to light, everything would change. The automatic door slid open. A young white woman walked in, her face free of pain, clothes pristine, her eyes glued to the screen of her phone. She headed straight to the reception desk, handed over her insurance card, smiled faintly at the attending nurse, and within 3 minutes, her name was called. Another nurse gently led her in, as if she were an emergency case in need of immediate care. The black man was still seated at the far end of the row. Sweat had soaked through his thin dress shirt. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, one hand still pressed firmly against his chest. His breathing was heavier now. But he didn't call for help. He didn't speak. He sat upright, calmly, trying to maintain his composure amidst a room increasingly filled with judging eyes. A white woman seated near him, her platinum-dyed hair neatly styled, a luxury watch gleaming on her wrist, looked him up and down. After a few seconds of scrutiny, she raised an eyebrow and said loud enough for those nearby to hear, probably just using a health excuse to skip the line. The atmosphere shifted. A few heads turned. Some chuckled quietly, others nodded as if she had said something undeniably true. All eyes were on the black man now, not with concern or empathy, but with judgment. As if his presence was an inconvenience, nothing more. From behind the cluttered reception desk, Karen, still busy sorting through the messy stack of forms, added her voice to the mix with a smug little smile. They're always shouting about fairness, but it's just another trick every time. She didn't say who they were, but everyone knew. The word sliced through the air like a hidden blade, subtle, but cruel. No one defended him. No one challenged her. The statement was so familiar, so normalized, that it barely registered as wrong anymore. The man said nothing. He didn't look at the woman. He didn't respond to Karen. He simply lowered his head slightly, his eyes settling on the floor. But beneath that quietness, something was stirring, a thought, a realization, silently taking root. A tall white security guard approached. His tone wasn't loud, but it was steeped in suspicion. "Do you need any help, sir?" The question didn't sound like concern. It felt more like an interrogation. His eyes scanned the man carefully, anticipating something, an outburst, maybe. As if he expected this quiet figure to turn aggressive at any moment. The man lifted his head. His voice was calm, steady. "I'm feeling a tightness in my chest. I just need to be examined. No complaint. No special request. Just a simple, honest answer from someone who knew something wasn't right with his body." But instead of being seen, he was dismissed. This time, openly and unmistakably. Karen looked up from her desk, eyes fixed on him, her voice firm and dismissive. "Wait your turn. We don't do special treatment here." Her words were a verdict. Not only did they ignore the pain clearly etched across the man's face, but they also stripped him of the most basic right to care, just because he didn't look like the others in the room. No one spoke up. No one objected. In that crowded space, he became more alone than ever. But he didn't leave. He remained seated. And this time, his eyes didn't fall to the floor. He lifted them, steady and unwavering, facing forward, not in surrender, but in silent defiance. The atmosphere in the emergency room seemed to have settled slightly, but not because things were under control. It was the kind of quiet that came from something heavier, an oppressive tension slowly taking over the room. The doors opened once more. A white man in clean sportswear, brisk and confident, walked in. He had barely completed the check-in procedure when his name blared over the intercom. No one questioned it. No one asked why someone who had just arrived was being seen so quickly. From the corner of the room, the black man watched. He blinked once, then turned toward the reception desk. In a calm, quiet voice, he asked, "Excuse me, was my file skipped?" There was no trace of accusation in his tone, just a simple question from someone seeking confirmation. But the response he received was sharp. Karen, still flipping through her disorganized stack of files, looked up and narrowed her eyes. "I'll decide who gets seen first." Her words were sharp, like a blade driven into his dignity. It wasn't medical judgment, it was sheer authority used with no accountability. And in that instant, the line between responsibility and bias became dangerously thin. A man nearby, in his 30s, glanced at the black man and smirked, "Guess you're not used to waiting in line." The words rang clear, deliberate. The room wasn't loud, but no one defended him. These kinds of insults had become routine, so normalized that they felt acceptable. As if mocking a black man for staying calm was somehow fair game. Suddenly, a small child sitting across from him tugged on his mother's sleeve, eyes wide with fear, and whispered, "Mommy, I'm scared." "His skin is as dark as the night," the mother quickly covered her child's mouth. But instead of correcting the child or offering an apology, she simply looked away, embarrassed. No one said a word. Karen heard it clearly and didn't react, except for a half smile, then a remark, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "It's okay. He's just here for attention." That comment fanned the flames. Another man, middle-aged with a scruffy beard, theatrically pinched his nose and made a loud sniffing sound before muttering, "What's that smell? Haven't showered all week." Now, all eyes were on him. Not because they were concerned about his health, but because they were watching, waiting, for a reaction. For him to stand up and lash out. Maybe, for some, that would be the real show. But the man didn't move. He didn't speak. His hands simply tightened slightly on his knees. His breathing slow and controlled. His gaze didn't meet anyone's eyes, but it didn't flinch either. He stared straight ahead, at the hallway that led to the treatment rooms, where pale white light spilled steadily through the automatic doors. His silence wasn't surrender. It was the silence of dignity, of a man who understood that not every battle needed to be fought with words. Because there are moments when staying seated, and not collapsing, is its own form of resistance. A protest, silent but powerful, in a room full of people who had already decided he was invisible. The emergency room remained thick with tension. The steady beeping from machines in the treatment area continued in the background, but outside, no one paid attention to the black man curled up at the end of the waiting room bench. He was still there, hand clutching his chest, sweat glistening on his forehead. His eyes, though weary from repeated humiliation, still held a trace of patience. A white man in his 40s, wearing a leather jacket, walked past the row of seats. In his hand was a large drink from the vending machine. Without stopping, without saying a word, he tilted the cup and poured the entire contents over the black man's leg, then continued walking as if nothing had happened. The cold water soaked through his pants, darkening the fabric from knee to ankle. The man flinched slightly. He looked down at the wet stain, not with anger, not with shock. He simply closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again. Karen was nearby. She had seen everything. But instead of intervening or offering help, she smirked and spoke loudly, "Take care of it yourself. This isn't a shoe cleaning service." A few people in the room burst into laughter. The laughs weren't loud, but they were sharp, like tiny needles. No one saw it as wrong. On the contrary, they treated it as something amusing, a lesson to be taught to someone who doesn't know their place. The man leaned slightly forward. This time, his hand moved slowly to his chest, not as a reflex, but from real pain. His breathing was heavier, deeper. His forehead creased, his facial muscles tensed. He was trying to manage the pain spreading deep through his chest. Then, in a voice rough with exhaustion, he spoke, "I think I have a heart condition," just 5 words, but spoken with immense effort. He didn't say it to plead. He said it because he still believed that in a hospital, Someone had to care. But Karen laughed, this time, not softly. She turned toward him, squinted mockingly, and practically shouted, "If it's that serious, call 911. I'm not here to babysit every single person." The room froze for a second, then dissolved into scattered murmurs. A young man with a buzz cut, wearing a tight t-shirt near the entrance, raised his middle finger toward the black man and growled, "You people are the reason this healthcare system's broken." No one stopped him. No eyes glared disapproval. The finger, the insult, the spilled drink, they had all become part of the normal order of that room. A chilling consensus built on silent approval. An old woman sitting across the room clutched her purse tightly, leaned toward her daughter, and whispered, "Don't look. That thing isn't worth your attention." The daughter glanced at the man for a brief second, then turned away. As if another second of eye contact might contaminate her. And the man, amid all the stares, all the cruel words, never moved. He didn't retaliate. He didn't leave. He simply bowed his head, propped his elbows on his knees, and rested his forehead on one hand. It was a posture of weariness, of endurance, of someone trying to stay conscious through the pain and the waves of humiliation. His body trembled slightly with each heavy breath. No one noticed. No one wanted to. In their eyes, he had already become invisible. But that silence, that refusal to leave, was the clearest signal yet. He was waiting. And what he waited for wasn't pity. It was justice. The air in the emergency room had grown even heavier, not just from the overcrowding, but from something darker and more toxic, something quietly simmering beneath the surface, coldness and cruelty. The black man remained slumped over, resting his head on his hand, trying to steady his breathing. The pain in his chest hadn't eased. His eyes were dull, glazed over. A young nurse, just starting her shift, had been watching from the moment she walked in. She couldn't hold back her concern. Gently, she picked up a clean towel and a bottle of water, slowly making her way toward him. In a soft voice, she asked, "Sir, do you need any help?" But before she could reach him, Karen cut her off with a harsh voice, "I forbid you." Her tone struck like a hammer. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Absolute and final. The young nurse froze. Her hands clutched the towel tightly, eyes locked in disbelief, not out of fear for the patient, but fear of the power that had just shut her down. She stepped back, helpless. Karen took a few steps forward, scanned the room, then raised her voice, as if delivering a sermon to a blind congregation, "This is not a charity kitchen. We don't do free checkups for people pretending to be sick." Some people nodded. Others chuckled coldly. No one spoke up. In that room, cruelty was not just allowed, it was reinforced by collective silence. A disheveled-looking white man walked past the black man and, without warning, dumped an entire cup of mouthwash onto the seat he had just vacated. The liquid splashed onto his shirt, soaked into his pants. No one stopped him. No one gasped. It seemed every boundary had already been crossed. And no one felt the need to hold on to even a shred of conscience. The man slowly rose to his feet. The motion was sluggish, but firm. His eyes were bloodshot, not from rage, but from the rush of blood to the head after long minutes of silent endurance. He stared directly at Karen. His voice was hoarse, slow, but each word rang out with clarity, "You are making a serious mistake." Karen didn't flinch. She burst into laughter. "Oh, should I be scared now? Is anyone here a witness that you're having a heart attack? Or is this another performance like always?" The room froze. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, a young man in the back pulled out his phone. He turned on the camera, slowly panning across the room, and said, This needs to go online. People need to see this." A few heads began to turn. A medical intern standing by the hallway quietly turned away. Another nurse, mid-charting, dropped her pen. Her face paled. She instinctively stepped back. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew this was no longer a normal situation. The man didn't say another word. Calmly, he reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a dark leather wallet. No one knew what he intended to do. No one tried to stop him. For the first time, every eye in the room was locked on him. He opened the wallet and took out a small, hard plastic object. He held it up, high, without saying a word. No explanation. But he didn't hand it to anyone. He didn't announce himself. He just held it long enough for everyone to get a clear look. Then he lowered his hand and tucked the card back into his wallet. His expression was calmer now. As if he knew the moment he'd been waiting for, was almost here. Karen didn't understand yet. The people around didn't either. But in that room, for the first time since he had entered, the crowd went completely silent. Not out of fatigue, but because they sensed something. That this was just the beginning of what was about to unfold. The emergency room had never been this quiet. The mockery, the bitter remarks, even the beeping of machines, everything seemed to be choked off by an invisible force, compressed into a single moment as the man rose to his feet. He stood tall. His voice wasn't loud or angry, but it cut through the room like a blade through a veil of indifference. I am Elijah Brooks, Federal Inspector for the U.S. Department of Health. I've been assigned to conduct an unannounced review of discriminatory practices in emergency care. No one moved. No one even breathed. His words made time feel like it had stopped. Every pair of eyes turned to him, not with mockery anymore, but with pure, stunned disbelief. This very man, the one they mocked, poured water on, laughed at, was the one with the authority to question everything they had just done. Not with accusations, but with power. Real power. From the back treatment area, an attending physician rushed out. Upon seeing Elijah, he froze. Eyes wide, his face turned pale. He couldn't even form his name, just a hoarse whisper, "Inspector." The tension in the room was electric. Karen had realized it too. She looked directly at the man now standing before her. Her lips trembled, her hands hung limp by her sides. No. No way. This can't be real. Elijah didn't respond to her. He simply looked at her, his gaze calm, but ice cold. I recorded everything. And I uploaded the data to the department's internal system before I stepped in here. His voice was steady, clear, as if every word had been prepared in advance, not for revenge, but to end it. Definitively. Unquestionably. A hospital administrator came running over, holding the badge he had shown earlier. She inspected every detail, every code. Then she looked up. No one prompted her. No one asked. But everyone waited. Her confirmation dropped like a gavel. Badge is valid. High clearance. Elijah Brooks is indeed a federal inspector. Just one sentence. One confirmation. But it shattered every prejudice that had been so carelessly stacked in the past half hour. The staff snapped into action. A senior doctor barked orders to the nurses to prep an inpatient examination room. A stretcher was rolled in. A security guard stepped forward and gently took Elijah's arm, a reflex born not of suspicion, but of respect. A complete reversal of their earlier treatment. The room stirred into motion, but no one dared raise their voice. It was no longer chaos, it was fear. A fear no one named, but everyone felt. Karen could no longer stand. She collapsed into a chair, her eyes vacant. Her face pale. She didn't cry, but her hands were clenched tight, trembling as if she were in shock. Everything she had said, everything she had done, now replayed in her mind like a film in reverse, each word, each action turning into evidence against her. Elijah was placed gently on the stretcher. But before being wheeled away, he turned his head. His eyes didn't settle on anyone in particular, yet everyone in that room felt as though he was staring right at them. He spoke softly. No emphasis. No threat. Just a simple sentence, sharp as a blade, "You messed with the wrong one." And that was all it took. No one dared to look at him the same way again. Because in that moment, they no longer saw a quiet black man, they saw the man they had never once judged fairly from the start. The news of the incident spread faster than any emergency case ever admitted to this hospital. Social media exploded in less than an hour. A short video capturing the man being ignored, splashed with water, and humiliated, then calmly flashing his federal inspector badge, was shared at lightning speed. The comments were filled with outrage. Everyone was asking the same question: how could such a prestigious hospital behave like this? That very afternoon, the director of St. Mary's Hospital arrived at the emergency ward. No prior notice. No assistance. He walked straight into the main hallway, his face tense, chin lowered, eyes sharp as knives. Upon arrival, he issued a direct order. All staff from this morning's shift, report to the conference room on the third floor immediately. His voice wasn't loud, but there was a force behind it that made everyone fall silent and obey. No one dared to question him. No one asked why. By the time the meeting began, the media had already gathered outside. Reporters crowded at the hospital gates. Some attempted to sneak into the reception area, looking for witnesses, snapping photos. Cameras, microphones, and blinding interview lights intensified an already tense atmosphere. Inside, Karen stood at the center of the conference room, surrounded by the stares of her co-workers, those who had witnessed everything but said nothing. No one defended her. No one offered sympathy. Only a heavy silence remained, and eyes that seemed to ask, "Why did you let this go so far?" The director placed a thick file on the table. It contained data extracted from the system, including the audio file Elijah had sent before stepping into the hospital. There was evidence. Witnesses. Video footage. Everything was clear. Karen was suspended on the spot. The director's voice was dry, emotionless. Suspended indefinitely, pending internal investigation. Karen said nothing. Her lips pressed tightly together. Her hands clenched so hard that her nails dug into her skin. Her face had lost all color, her eyes blank and dry. Everything she once controlled, everything she believed she had power over, collapsed without warning. In a corner of the room, a young nurse whispered to the colleague beside her, "We just ruined the hospital's reputation." The words were quiet, but they pierced the collective pride like a needle. No one argued. Because everyone knew she was right. Out in the hallway, a middle-aged woman, weary and teary-eyed, approached Elijah, who was now seated, awaiting post-cardiac evaluation. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke, voice trembling, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said what I did this morning. I was wrong. I truly am sorry." Elijah looked up. He wasn't angry. He didn't turn away. But neither did he soften. His eyes were calm, deep, and resolute. Then he spoke, softly but clearly, "I don't need an apology. I need change." She nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. She had no more words to give. That same evening, the hospital released an internal memo, followed by a public statement on its website and social platforms. All medical personnel will undergo mandatory retraining in professional ethics and equitable treatment, under the supervision of the Department of Health. The statement was brief. No excuses. No sugarcoating. But it carried the weight of a necessary fall. A fall that would awaken something essential. Elijah left the hospital as the sun dipped behind the city's western skyline. There was no applause. No one ran after him to apologize. He simply walked away, quietly, the sleeves of his shirt still creased from the water spilled that morning. But now, each step he took carried a deeper strength. His eyes didn't look back. He didn't need to look down. He looked forward, toward a city still bustling as if nothing had happened. But within him, something had been restored. Not honor. Faith. Calm. Composed. No yelling. No revenge. Because he understood, true justice is quiet, but it is never absent. Evening was settling in. The last rays of sunlight flickered faintly through the pale gray clouds on the horizon. In front of St. Mary's Hospital's main entrance, the air had grown thick, heavy with flashing cameras, microphones, and floodlights, all focused on a single person, Karen. Gone was the stern posture of the head nurse. She stood still amid the press swarm, her figure seemed smaller, her shoulders burdened by an invisible weight. Her face was pale, stripped of makeup, her eyes hollow and dazed, as if she hadn't slept all night. The flashes snapped incessantly, capturing every twitch, every frown, every flicker of fear in her expression. A young reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand, asking loud and clear, without a trace of hesitation, "Do you regret it?" The question cut through the clicks of camera shutters. The crowd seemed to freeze for a moment. Karen flinched slightly, her confused gaze scanning the people facing her. Some were former patients. Some were past co-workers, people who once laughed with her, now looking at her silently. No anger. No support. Only disappointment. She lowered her head, hands tightly clenched, fingernails digging into her skin. Her lips trembled before finally forcing out a voice, hoarse and broken, "I underestimated someone I should never have underestimated." No one said a word. No applause. No blame. But the silence that enveloped her was the most terrifying thing. It was a collective confirmation that what she said was true. And that it came, too late. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere had changed. Gone were the rowdy noises, the mocking stares. The hallways felt unusually orderly. Medical staff no longer rushed about. No one acted indifferent. Every step seemed deliberate, as if everyone was now measuring their actions carefully. As Mr. Elijah Brooks walked through the waiting area, every staff member and patient stood up. No one said a word, yet all bowed their heads in unison. No one needed to be told, it was a reflex born of genuine respect. Not for his title, but for the values he had just re-established in this place. A young nurse, just beginning her shift, stood against the wall, clutching the edge of her white coat. She bowed her head, eyes glistening but not crying. An older doctor with silver hair stood near the treatment room door. He nodded slowly, his gaze heavy and contemplative, as if re-evaluating his entire career. In the waiting area, an elderly patient leaned toward the person beside them and whispered, "He's a symbol of quiet strength." The voice was barely audible, almost vanishing into the air, but enough to still those who heard it. Because it was no longer just a compliment, it was the truth. As Elijah passed the administrative wing, he paused. On a newly installed glass wall stood the hospital's honor board. In the center, a brass plaque had been mounted, boldly etched in shining metal, "Elijah Brooks, Federal Inspector, U.S. Department of Health." And beneath that, in smaller but sharper letters than any praise could offer, "Dedicated to justice, dignity, and ethics in health care." He stared at the plaque for a few seconds. No smile. No nod. His eyes were calm, not out of pride, but because he knew this recognition wasn't just for him. It was for every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced in rooms full of prejudice. He walked on. His figure faded into the corridor behind, quiet, steady, and full of gravity. And this time, no one dared look away. This story began with indifference, A glance that passed too quickly, a medical form tossed aside, a cold remark, not an emergency. And then it escalated. Into bias. Into mockery. And finally, into a stain that an entire institution couldn't wash away. But something made the story different. That man, Mr. Elijah Brooks, didn't explode in anger. He didn't lash out impulsively. He didn't even need to wield his power to demand instant respect. He chose silence. He chose observation. He allowed every action to reveal itself for what it truly was. And only when the humiliation had reached its peak, did he stand, not to defend himself, but to reveal the truth. The truth that he was never just a victim. He was the one holding up a mirror to everyone in that room. Amid a storm of cruel words, he did not retaliate. Under judgmental stares, he did not waver. And through the hurricane of prejudice, he chose calm. He chose quiet strength, the kind of strength those who abuse authority will never understand. This story makes us wonder, how many times in life have we judged someone by their skin, their clothes, or how they walked into a room? How many times have we silently decided who deserves respect, and who doesn't? Perhaps the most frightening thing isn't the hateful words, but the silence of those who know it's wrong, and do nothing. So who are you? The one who silently lets injustice slide by? Or the one who chooses to say that's enough, when someone is humiliated and no one else speaks up? This lesson isn't just for the medical field. It's for all of us, those of us living in a world where a single misjudged look can hurt a heart that's simply trying to walk forward in peace. Remember, real strength doesn't need to prove itself. It only needs to be seen, at the right moment. If this story moved you, share this video. Help remind others that respect isn't something we earn after we prove ourselves, it should be the starting point. Drop a comment below, what did you take away from Elijah Brooks? Have you ever faced or witnessed something similar? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening stories, where even silence has a voice, and justice always finds its time to speak.